Hello, everybody. On this forum of Symposium IAS today, we are going to discuss takeaways and the outcomes of Conference of Party 29, which was conducted at Baku, Azerbaijan recently. Although the two-week conference was scheduled to end on November 22nd, but was running overtime and ended on November 24th, that's Sunday. Now, we can see that when you talk about Conference of Party, the UNFCCC, that is United Nations Framework for Convention on Climate Change, was established in 1992 at Rio de Janeiro, where the Earth Summit was conducted. And the UNFCCC convenes its annual meet in the form of what? In the form of Conference of Party every year that is conducted. And that was conducted, the COP29 was conducted at Baku, Azerbaijan. So that's what exactly is COP. It's also called as the Global Talks on Climate Change. Negotiations are conducted and 198 nations entered into an agreement. A deal was signed that $300 billion would be transferred from the developed nation to developing nation or the poor nation to meet the challenge of global warming and climate change. But $300 billion would be coming by the year 2035. 2035. When you talk about climate finance, we have discussed in earlier lecture what exactly is climate finance. It's an amount of fund to be transferred by the developed nation to developing nation for mitigating the impact of global warming and climate change. Why? Because the developed nations are considered as historical emitters. And developing nations believe on what is called as polluter pays principle. Those who are responsible for global warming and climate change should be also responsible for paying for the damage, liable for the damage financially, and developing nations also believe on what is called as not only polluter pays principle but also ecological depth. We have discussed earlier that the developed nations under their colonial or imperial rule has utilized the resources of developing nations. So this is called as ecological depths. And it's also based on CBDR, that is common but differentiated responsibility. And climate finance can be of different types. Climate finance was of a type called Green Climate Fund, which was negotiated at the Cancun meet in 2009 and was established at the it was negotiated at the Copenhagen meet in 2009. It was established at Cancun meet 2010. And this was implemented under the Paris Declaration. And this was to come into force in 2020, but came into force in 2022. And from then on, we can see $100 billion were paid by developed nation to developing nation for mitigating the impact of global warming and climate change. But this would continue to 2025 only. So we see that there is a decade gap in climate finance from 2025 to 2035, because the deal which has been signed at Baku, Azerbaijan, says that it would be implemented in 2035. Now, the developing nations were against it. Developing nations say that they have been woefully cheated. Why? Because they say that for mitigating the impact of global warming and climate change, $1.3 trillion is required at least. $1.3 trillion is required at least. So this is very less than the requirement. Very less than the requirement. And the purpose is what? The purpose is to implement the Paris Declaration. The main target of Paris Declaration. Paris Declaration, which was signed in 2015, says that temperature enhancement of Earth should be less than 2 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. And it would be better if nations meet the target of what? If nations meet the target of less than 1.5 degrees centigrade enhancement. And less than 1.5 degrees centigrade enhancement is based on the likings of what? least developed countries. And it was also based on the IPCC report. IPCC report said that why the world cannot afford temperature enhancement beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade, because this would be a catastrophic situation for Earth. So Paris Declaration says that temperature enhancement of Earth should be less than 1.5 degrees centigrade. And to deliver to that target, climate finance is required. Loss and damage fund is also a type of climate finance. Loss and damage fund, it was negotiated at Sharm el Sheikh COP27 and it was implemented at the COP28 Dubai. But we can see that climate action fund, which was to be negotiated, and this was to be negotiated at Baku, and the formal name for negotiations on climate finance at Baku was termed as what? You can get this as question, NCQG, that is New Collective Quantitative Goal. This is the formal name for negotiations on climate finance, and this is called as NCQG. So first remember this. Then second thing that you have to see is that there are many challenges on climate finance. First thing is that when we talk about the developed nations are facing a problem because they have tight domestic budgets these days. The European countries are also facing economic crisis. US itself is facing economic crisis. And on the other hand, developing nations are reeling under the impact of floods, droughts, and other disasters due to the impact of global warming and climate change. So both the group of countries, be it the North or be it the South, are reeling under some kind of pressure. So it was said that this was a tough negotiation, although the developing nations rejected this. They said that it's not worth, because $1.3 trillion was at least required. But when we talk about the other outcomes of COP was also the rules which were meant for carbon credit. Carbon credit are what? Carbon credit are certificates given to nations, to organizations for reducing carbon emissions, for reduction in carbon emissions, and one credit is given or one certificate is allocated for 1 metric ton of CO2 reduced. So the rules for carbon market would be also pumping in more and more of climate finance. That's another outcome of the meet as such. But when we talk about what are the challenges in climate finance after COP29 was convened, there are many challenges as such. The first challenge is victory of Mr. Trump. Now, very easily we see victory of Mr. Trump. He would be US president. Why? Because Mr. Trump has said that global warming is a myth and also pressed for withdrawing from the Paris declarations. Withdrawing for the Paris declaration. The second problem is what? That the Western nations, their priorities have shifted. The national priorities have shifted. They no longer emphasize on global warming and climate change and climate finance. And why their priorities have shifted? Because of geopolitical situations, geopolitical tensions, not in the Middle East, but also the conflict due to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So their geopolitical challenges, priorities have shifted. Third thing is the amount is too low according to developing nation. And deadline is also a decade far because it would be implemented in 2035. So that's the third challenge. The fourth challenge is that developed countries also want contributions from developing nations. Contributions from developing nations. And developing nations, they say that if we contribute now for mitigating the impact of global warming and climate change, then we cannot meet the target of tripling the renewable energy capacity as decided under the COP28. Because the Dubai Declaration talks about transitioning away from fossil fuel. Nothing has been said. Nothing has been said in the Baku Declaration on transitioning away from the fossil fuel. And also it emphasizes on tripling of renewable energy capacity, and nothing has been said about that too. So the developing nations say that if we have to meet the target of the Dubai Declaration, then how can we be also responsible for climate? How can we contribute in climate finance? That would be undermining the implementation of the Dubai Declaration as such. Now, next challenge is what? Despite years of negotiations, temperature is rising. You can see that 2024 is going to be one of the hottest year, and the global emission gap report, the emission gap report 2024 has said what? Has said if we continue at this pace, the emissions continue at this pace, the temperature enhancement of Earth by the end of this century would be 3.1 degrees centigrade. And 3.1 degrees centigrade means where is the Paris Declaration? Nowhere near is the Paris Declaration as such. Next is what? Trade barriers of developed nations. Some countries, for example, the European Union, have developed a trade barrier which is called as cross-border adjustment mechanism. And they would be imposing tariffs on goods which are imported to Europe, imposing tariffs on goods which are imported to Europe. And the purpose is what? The purpose is the importers in Europe would have to declare the quantity and the amount of embedded emission. Embedded emission means, suppose this watch is produced. So what amount of emission was there in producing this watch? So this watch carries embedded emission. And the purpose is to sift those goods to those countries which would be called as countries of carbon leakage, where flexible environmental norms are there. So that's called as cross-border adjustment mechanism. Certainly, India would be impacted upon by these kind of trade barriers. Why? Because it would be implemented in 2026, starting from 2026. And a tariff of more than 19% to 52% would be imposed on goods from India. For example, iron and steel, because India is one of the biggest exporter of iron and steel to Europe. And this would be another challenge as such. Clear? US has also said, Mr. Trump also has said that he would be imposing trade barriers, tariffs. Small island nation and least developed countries, hardly mentioned. They have not been mentioned in this declaration as such. So no attention has been paid to them. Now, as far as India's stand on COP29 is concerned, India says that climate finance is inadequate. Certainly, India was for $1.3 trillion to be given by the developed nation to developing nations. So this is inadequate according to India. And climate finance should not be treated as investment goal of developed nation. The climate finance would be coming not only from public but also from private partnership. So India says that should not be treated as investment goal by the developed nation. Now, mitigation work program. India's stand on mitigation work program started at Sarvel Sake, COP27. The purpose is mitigating the impact of global warming. But India's stand on mitigation work program is what? India says that it should emphasize on transfer of technology for cutting off emissions, rather than put pressure on developing nation to immediately take action. Because if you put pressure on developing nation, this would undermine their efforts for developing renewable energy. On the other hand, the developed nation want immediate action to be taken not only by developed nation but also by developing nation. One thing is that the developed nation at the meet COP29 also said that other countries should be included. For example, China. China is in the category of developing nation, but China is the second biggest economy of the world. China is the second biggest emitter of the world also. The concern is not only Mr. Trump. Now, like-minded developing countries, which includes developing nations like India, China, all these countries, they emphasize also that this fund is inadequate. And they say that the developed nation are shifting goals. They are shifting goals from one goal to another goals. So they are not serious about global warming and climate change. You see, some of the questions which I have drafted for you all. Now, one which I have mentioned, cross-border adjustment mechanism, which would be implemented by Europe, and this would be implemented starting from 2026. Now, which one of the following is incorrect about cross-border adjustment mechanism? It would be implemented by Europe in 2026. That's true. Second, it would be implemented for 6 products initially. That's also true. It requires importers to declare quantity of goods and their embedded greenhouse gases emission. That's also true. What is false is it would end the mechanism of collecting carbon tax presently enforced. It's a type of carbon tax only. It's a type of carbon. And I told you that the interests of India would be impacted upon because India is one of the biggest exporter of iron and steel to European nations. And the tariff imposed would be from more than 19 to 52%. That's going to impact India. Second question, which among the following countries have potentially withdrawn from the Paris Agreement that significantly affected the morale of negotiators at COP29? Now, the correct answer for this is what? US and Argentina. US and Argentina. Third, COP30 would be conducted in 2025 in which one of the following cities of Brazil? The correct answer is Belém. Because the declaration, the deal which was passed at COP29 lays the groundwork for negotiations at COP30. And COP30 would be mainly emphasizing on the new nationally determined contributions. Nationally determined contributions. We'll talk about these things in module. So it would be emphasizing on that. Let's see the fourth question. Consider the following statements and select the correct code. Mitigation work program was created 2 years ago at Sharm el-Sheikh. That just now I have discussed. COP27, it was conducted. Developed nation want immediate action from all nations under this program. Yes, definitely they have this stand. And developing nations want sharing of solutions for cutting emission preferred first. That's also true. So all the 3 statements are correct. So this is a brief of COP29 with some of the questions which can be asked in examination. Thank you so much and meet you very shortly.